Now that I have all these pieces on my table, it is time to take them off of the table and put them in a box. So I'm a bit of a budget modeler. I use a box because it's cheaper than getting an entire painting ventilation system. But someday I hope to have one of those. If you have one of those, definitely use it. But for me, I like to use a box and a fan going right next to me to kind of suck out the fumes, and I just wear an N95 to kind of catch some of those paint particles. And so far, I haven't died, so I must be doing something right. So before we can start painting, I need to make a good Russian green. To start, I used Tamiya Field Gray as a base. Then I added Tamiya Yellow Green to give it a slightly warmer tone. And I finally added a bit of dark green, which kind of brought it back down to more of a green tan color. I don't really have a recipe for this, but if you want to make this yourself, I'd say it's about 2 parts Field Gray, 1 part yellow green, and another part dark green, if that makes sense. But just experiment and you should get something pretty similar. After I got the airbrush loaded up, it was time to get a good base coat on the tank. I pretty much just sprayed this green all over the tank and the wheels, and that was pretty much it. Once I was done, I had a very green and clean looking tank. So after I got the main body of the tank painted, it was time to move on to the road wheels, where I painted the inside and the outside 14 times, because this tank has tons of road wheels, not as many as German tanks. Thank God, I lose my mind. But I stuck them all in this putty. Don't do this. This is a camouflage masking putty, and it didn't really hold them in there. Use a piece of like foam or something. That usually works pretty well, but I didn't have any, so yeah. So for this model, I wanted to use a pretty simple highlight and shadow paint job. To do this, you pretty much just mix a slightly darker version of your base coat and spray it from the bottom in all the places that would normally be shadowed. It's super easy to do, and it gives just solid results, which is why I like to use it. After getting the shadow coat on, it was time to get the highlight coat on. Basically the same process, except reversed, I guess. Instead of using more dark green, you use more yellow green, and you spray it from the top down. And yeah, that's pretty much our highlight and shadows done, which is pretty nice. So after I had got the base colors on, it was time to start with the weathering. I always like to start with this pin streaking method, which basically takes oil paints and dots them all over the tank, and then I use a flat brush to kind of push the oil paints into streaking marks. It's super easy, and it pretty much just gives a bit of variation to the color and keeps it from looking too flat. After that, I figured the next step that I needed to work on was a wash. I wanted to use the brown oil paint, and to do this, I just took some of my thinner and mixed it with the paint. Oil paint doesn't dry out nearly as fast as acrylic, so you can thin it down and it'll stay nice and thin and wash-like for hours. It's really easy to do, and I prefer to do this versus buying washes. I just said that I don't like to buy pre-made washes, the black Tamiya panel filler is the only exception to that. And I like to use it with other washes because the thing is it's the same as the Tamiya paints, where it thins using alcohol, which means that when you use thinner to clean it up, it doesn't interact with oil paints, so you don't have to worry about messing up the layers that you already put on. Yeah, so I just put it on like a normal wash, and that was that. I figured now would be a good time to get started on chipping. I like to use dark gray and a little bit of natural steel from Vallejo, and I just dab it on using a bit of sponge. You just soak up a little bit of paint and get most of it off on a paper towel, and you just kind of blot it on. Super easy. It's kind of like dry brushing almost. You don't want to have too much paint on the sponge, or else you'll get like some big blocky paint patches, and that's not what you're really looking for. You're trying to get like small bits of just gray all over the model. And yeah, I tried to kind of have a lot on the edges and by the hatches and areas where, you know, you have people and crew kind of scraping the paint off. I wanted to add a little bit of rust to the tank to kind of give it a bit more color variation. I added dark brown from Vallejo into the larger gray spots, just where the steel would be exposed when the paint chipped off, and I feel like it came out looking pretty nice. Most Soviet vehicles have their interiors painted white, so I wanted to get the inside parts of the hatches painted white as well. The only problem was the only white that I have in my kit is this Tamiya flat white, which is really bad because this is the worst possible brush painting paint that you could ever use. It has a lot of issues. Mainly it just dries really quickly and its coverage just doesn't really work well. It's more for airbrush painting, but I didn't have another option, so after I got about 4 to 5 coats of the stuff on, it started to look pretty good, so I'm pretty happy with the result. To get some spilled fuel on the tank, I use the MiG engine fuel and oil. It's pretty good, it just looks wet all the time, which is the point. It looks pretty similar to spilled diesel, which I like, and that's the effect that I wanted to go for. I mainly just put it around the nozzles of the external fuel tanks and on some of the hinges and just some random spots where I thought fuel might be dripped onto. Now that most of the details are painted, I figured it was time to put the crews in their places. This was pretty easy, just remove the wires out from their butts and glue them into place using some super glue. The most difficult one to get in was probably the guy who's sticking his head out of the loader's hatch, mainly because there just wasn't anywhere to put him, but I eventually got him, and now they're all sitting in their places. The last thing that needed to be taken care of were the wheels. Before I could actually put them on the tank, though, I needed to paint the rubber. I decided to use just this black craft paint. It works pretty well. It dries completely flat, which I like, but it doesn't matter too much because I'm planning on at least partially covering these with mud, but we'll get to that later. super glued the wheels to these toothpicks when I started this project just to make them easier to handle and paint. If you do that, make sure you don't use that much super glue because it makes them very difficult to take off. And when you do take them off, don't twist the toothpick because it'll break inside the wheel and it's kind of a pain to get out. But once I got them removed, I just put them on the tank and it started to look a bit more tank-like. The idler and sprocket wheels on the T-34 are metal on metal with the tracks, so it's pretty common to see them have their paint worn off, and they usually have a shinier metal appearance. So I started with some dark gray and then rubbed a bit of graphite onto them, and it gave this really nice, subtle, shiny look to them, which I really liked. So I actually forgot to paint the spare track link on the back of the turret. I